For centuries, a single piece of ancient cloth has divided the world into two camps: believers who call it sacred, skeptics who call it a fake. When modern genetics stepped into that debate, researchers extracted DNA from microscopic particles trapped inside the fibers, ran it against global genetic databases, and got back something far messier and more complicated than a simple answer in either direction. That cloth is the Shroud of Turin, and what the DNA actually showed, and what it didn't, is the story we're following today. I'm Arif Hassan, and this is AH History. The Shroud of Turin is a rectangular linen cloth, roughly 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, kept in a silver case inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. Under ordinary light, it shows a faint brownish image of a bearded man, front and back, with marks consistent with wounds to the wrists, feet, and side, and marks across the back consistent with flogging. There's no visible paint or pigment. The discoloration sits in the very top layer of the linen fibers. The shroud first appears clearly in recorded history around 1353 in France, in the possession of a knight named Geoffrey de Charny, before moving through Lirey and Chambéry and arriving in Turin in 1578, where it's remained since. The Catholic Church has never officially declared it authentic. A cardinal in the 1980s called it a historical symbol rather than a verified relic. But the Church hasn't dismissed it either. Here's something worth knowing up front, because it's central to how skeptics approach this whole story. In 1389, Bishop Pierre d'Arcy of Troyes wrote a memorandum to the Avignon Pope, stating that the cloth was a painted forgery, and that the artist responsible had reportedly confessed. That document is a real part of the historical record, and it's the single strongest piece of evidence for anyone arguing this is a medieval creation rather than an ancient burial cloth. Any honest treatment of this topic has to hold that alongside everything that follows. In 1898, an amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was given permission to photograph the shroud during a public exhibition. When he developed his glass plates, the negative image looked more like a clear, three-dimensional human face than the original faint image did, meaning the shroud behaves like a photographic negative centuries before photography existed. That observation is well documented and genuinely puzzling. Nobody has definitively explained how it happened. Over the following century, X-ray, ultraviolet, infrared, laser scanning, and spectroscopy studies found that the image sits in a chemically altered layer roughly 200 nanometers deep in the outer fibers, not applied pigment. A 2018 study from the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility explored whether an intense, short burst of ultraviolet radiation could theoretically reproduce that kind of surface effect. It's worth being precise here. That paper explored a possible physical mechanism. It did not claim the effect requires energy beyond what any technology, ancient or modern, could produce. And mainstream researchers in the field have proposed other candidate explanations too, including various contact and vaporographic imaging theories from decades of prior shroud research. No single explanation has been universally accepted, which is different from saying physics can't account for it at all. Now, the DNA research. In 2015, and again in a follow-up study published as a preprint around 2026, a team led by geneticist Gianni Barcaccia at the University of Padua analyzed microscopic particles vacuumed from the shroud's surface using next-generation sequencing. Their published results found roughly 55.6% of the human DNA present matched populations from the Near East, about 38.7% matched populations from the Indian subcontinent, and less than 6% matched European populations, alongside smaller traces linked to North Africa, East Africa, and other regions. The later study also identified a mitochondrial haplogroup called H33, found today mainly in the Near East, and notably among the Druze community. Here's the part that matters most, and it's the part popular retellings usually leave out. Barcaccia himself, the scientist who led this research, described the result as a cornucopia of contamination from centuries of handling, and told reporters plainly, "We cannot say anything more on its origin." The study also turned up DNA from cats, dogs, cattle, pigs, and food crops like carrots, wheat, corn, peanuts, and bananas, the kind of mixed signal you'd expect from a large, cloth-handled, restored, and displayed by enormous numbers of people over roughly 700 years of documented European history alone, not necessarily evidence of a specific ancient journey. Other geneticists reviewing the same data have been blunt that DNA contamination on an object handled this many times by this many people simply can't reconstruct a travel history with any confidence. The genetic mixture is consistent with centuries of exhibitions, restorations, and pilgrim contact in Europe just as easily as it is with an older Middle Eastern or Asian origin. So while the Near Eastern and Indian genetic signatures are real, published findings, the specific narrative of the cloth traveling from Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople to France, the version many popular videos present as proven by this DNA, is not something the researchers themselves have confirmed. It's one possible interpretation layered on top of ambiguous data, not a settled conclusion. The pollen evidence is often presented alongside the DNA as independent support. Researchers Max Frey-Sulzer and Avinoam Danin, working separately, decades apart, identified pollen from dozens of plant species on the cloth, including some native to the Jerusalem-Jericho region, notably Gundelia tournefortii, a thorny desert shrub whose stems have been proposed as a plausible material for a crude woven crown. It's worth knowing this evidence has its own controversy. Frey's original pollen sampling method, using adhesive tape pressed onto the cloth, has been criticized by other palynologists for chain of custody concerns and for not being independently replicated under controlled conditions. And some of his broader conclusions about the shroud, unrelated to the pollen, were later shown to be mistaken. That doesn't mean the pollen findings are worthless, but it means they carry real methodological caveats that are often left out of more sensational retellings. Then there's the blood. A 2017 study using modern analytical techniques found the stains contain actual blood rather than pigment, typed as AB, with elevated creatinine and ferritin levels that some researchers associate with severe physical trauma. These findings come from a body of forensic shroud research going back to chemist Walter McCrone and blood researcher Alan Adler in the 1980s, whose conclusions about the blood have themselves been debated within that research community for decades, including disagreements over sample contamination and testing methods. And then there's the radiocarbon dating that many people assume settled this entirely. In 1988, independent labs at Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona all dated the cloth to between 1260 and 1390, squarely medieval. Some shroud researchers, most notably chemist Raymond Rogers, later argued the tested sample came from a corner that had been rewoven with newer thread during a medieval repair, which could have skewed the date younger. That hypothesis is real and has been taken seriously in some circles, but it remains contested. Several textile scientists and statisticians who've reviewed the repair theory don't find it conclusive, and the medieval radiocarbon date still lines up with the shroud's first clear appearance in verified historical records around 1353, and with Bishop Darcis's 1389 account. So where does this actually leave us? The image itself remains genuinely unusual and not fully explained by any single accepted mechanism. The DNA and pollen findings are real, published results showing a genetically and botanically diverse cloth. But the scientists who generated the DNA data have said directly that it doesn't establish where the shroud came from, and the pollen work carries real methodological questions. The blood chemistry findings are debated within forensic shroud research itself, and the radiocarbon date, while contested by some, still aligns with the clearest historical documentation we have, including a 14th century bishop who reported the artist's own confession. None of this proves the shroud is a medieval forgery, and none of it proves it's an ancient burial cloth either. What the honest version of this story actually shows is a genuinely contested scientific and historical debate, not a mystery that DNA quietly solved. If you want history and science covered, with the real caveats left in instead of smoothed over, follow this channel, because there's a lot more of this kind of investigation still worth doing properly.